The Interstellar Institute of Sonic Perfection floated in the void like a crystalline symphony made manifest, its bioluminescent walls pulsing in rhythm with the cosmic harmonies that supposedly governed all civilized communication. Here, in the academic heart of the Melodia Station, the galaxy's most refined beings gathered to study what they considered the ultimate expression of intelligence, the ability to make pretty sounds. It was, one might observe, a remarkably shallow foundation for an entire educational philosophy, but the universe had never been particularly concerned with logical consistency. Professor Zixandor Vel'thune stood at the center of the Institute's most prestigious lecture hall, his 7-foot frame rippling with the kind of controlled elegance that marked the Harmonist species as natural aristocrats of auditory achievement. His skin, a shifting canvas of iridescent blues and purples, responded to his emotional state with the subtlety of a master artist's brush. When he spoke, which he did frequently and with considerable self-satisfaction, his voice produced frequencies that could calm savage beasts, inspire poetry in the mathematically minded, and generate what the Institute's marketing department called transcendent auditory experiences. The assembled students, a carefully curated collection of the galaxy's most vocally gifted specimens, hung on his every syllable with the devotion typically reserved for religious experiences. There were the melodians, whose crystalline throat structures could generate perfect pitch across 17 octaves, the whisper folk of Nebula 7, whose barely audible communications could convey complex emotional symphonies, even a few resonant spiders, whose web-building songs could induce mathematical enlightenment in lesser species. And then there was Raven Thorne. She sat in the back corner of the lecture hall, a compact figure in utilitarian clothing that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical knot that suggested she had more important things to worry about than aesthetic presentation. Her skin bore the kind of weathered tan that spoke of a world where the sun was not a gentle companion, but a daily adversary to be endured. Most tellingly, her posture carried the alert stillness of someone accustomed to environments where relaxation could prove fatal. She was, in short, everything the Institute was not. Today, Professor Vel'thune announced, his voice cascading through the hall like liquid music, we shall explore the fundamental principles of harmonic hierarchy theory, the concept that communication capability directly correlates with evolutionary sophistication. He gestured with a kind of theatrical flourish that suggested he had practiced this lecture in front of mirrors. As we have established in previous sessions, the ability to produce refined auditory experiences is the hallmark of truly advanced civilization. It separates the cultured from the crude, the evolved from the primitive. Several students nodded in sage agreement, their various auditory organs attuned to the professor's wisdom with the precision of finely tuned instruments. This principle, Vel'thune continued, his skin shifting to a confident gold that indicated he was approaching his favorite topic, becomes particularly relevant when we consider the recent expansion of our student body to include representatives from less acoustically gifted worlds. His gaze settled on Raven with the kind of academic interest typically reserved for particularly fascinating specimens of evolutionary failure. Miss Thorne, he said, his voice carrying the patient condescension of someone addressing a particularly slow child, perhaps you would care to demonstrate your homeworld's approach to vocal communication? The request was delivered with the kind of polite malice that made it clear this was not actually a request. Raven stood slowly, her movement carrying the economical precision of someone who had learned to conserve energy for when it mattered most. Of course, Professor, she replied, and immediately the acoustic balance of the room shifted. Her voice was rough, unpolished, carrying undertones that spoke of a world where communication had evolved not for beauty, but for survival. It was the voice of a species that had learned to make itself heard over the howl of storms, the roar of predators, and the screams of their own dying planet. The effect on the refined audience was immediate and unmistakable. Several students winced openly, their delicate auditory systems offended by the harsh realities of Deathworld evolution. One particularly sensitive melodian actually covered her crystal resonators with her gossamer hands, Professor Vel'thune's skin flickered through several shades of barely concealed disgust, settling on a deep purple that indicated he was experiencing something between amusement and revulsion. Yes, well, that certainly illustrates the challenges we face when dealing with primitive vocal development. A ripple of nervous laughter swept through the class, the kind of sound that suggested the audience was not entirely comfortable with the direction of the demonstration but was too polite to object. You see, class, Vel'thune continued, warming to his theme with the enthusiasm of someone who had found the perfect teaching moment, evolution is not a democratic process. It does not distribute gifts equally among all species. Some, like ourselves, develop the capacity for truly sophisticated communication. Others. He paused, looking directly at Raven with the kind of scientific detachment that suggested he was studying a particularly interesting form of primitive life. Others develop what we might charitably call survival-oriented noise production. The laughter this time was more genuine, fed by the students' growing confidence that their professor was about to deliver one of his famous intellectual demolitions. Professor Vel'thune was renowned throughout the academic community for his ability to dissect the pretensions of inferior species with surgical precision. The human vocal apparatus, he continued, beginning to pace with the fluid grace that marked all truly superior beings, represents a fascinating case study in evolutionary compromise. Designed for a world where subtlety was a luxury they could not afford, it prioritizes volume over beauty, force over finesse. It is, quite literally, the vocal equivalent of a blunt instrument. He moved to the front of the class, his voice rising into what the Harmonists considered high art, a perfectly modulated discourse that combined intellectual superiority with aesthetic beauty. Consider, if you will, the profound irony of our current situation. Here we have a species that has somehow convinced itself it belongs among the stars, and yet it cannot produce a single tone without causing auditory distress to truly civilized beings. Raven had been listening with the kind of stillness that predators perfected over millions of years of evolution. Her face remained neutral, but there was something in her eyes that might have warned a more observant critic that he was venturing into dangerous territory. The human voice, Vel'thune continued, his confidence growing with each perfectly crafted syllable, is perhaps the most compelling evidence we have for the theory that intelligence and communication ability are not necessarily linked. Here we have a species that has achieved interstellar travel, and yet their primary form of expression remains fundamentally crude. He gestured toward Raven with the kind of theatrical dismissal that suggested he was demonstrating a particularly obvious scientific principle. It is communication without artistry, expression without refinement. It is, in essence, the sound of a species that has mistaken noise for language. The class was now fully engaged, their initial discomfort replaced by the intellectual pleasure of watching their professor dismantle the pretensions of an inferior species with elegant precision. This was why they had come to the Institute, to witness the kind of sophisticated academic destruction that separated the truly educated from the merely knowledgeable. "Professor," Raven said quietly, and once again her voice cut through the refined atmosphere like a blade through silk, "I think you might be making some assumptions about human vocal capabilities that aren't entirely accurate." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Challenging a professor was considered highly inappropriate in institute culture, but challenging Professor Vel'thune was practically an act of academic suicide. He was not merely an instructor but a celebrity, author of the definitive text on harmonic supremacy in galactic communication, and holder of the prestigious Resonance Crown for outstanding contributions to sonic theory. Vel'thune's skin shifted to a deep crimson that indicated he was experiencing something between outrage and amusement. "Oh, indeed. And what exactly would you know about proper vocal technique, Miss Thorne? Did your Deathworld provide extensive training in acoustic refinement?" "Actually," Raven said, her voice carrying a quality that the students were beginning to recognize as distinctly unsettling, "it did." The professor's laugh was a masterpiece of condescension, a perfectly crafted sound that managed to convey superiority, amusement, and pity all in one melodious package. "How fascinating. Please, By all means, enlighten us about the sophisticated vocal traditions of, what do you call your planet? Dirt? Mud? Terra? Earth, Raven corrected, and there was something in the way she said it that made the word sound less like a name and more like a declaration of war. Earth, Vel'thune repeated, somehow managing to make the word sound provincial and slightly ridiculous. And what, pray tell, did Earth teach you about vocal refinement? Raven walked to the front of the class with the kind of steady, purposeful movement that suggested she was accustomed to navigating hostile territory. The students watched with fascination, the way one might observe a particularly interesting experiment that was about to go dramatically wrong. Earth taught me that communication isn't about making pretty sounds, she said, her voice carrying an edge that made the walls seem to vibrate. It's about being heard, being understood, and when necessary, being obeyed. Vel'thune's skin flickered through several shades of dismissive amusement. Obeyed? My dear child, we are discussing the highest forms of artistic expression, not primitive intimidation techniques. Are we? Raven asked, and for the first time, her voice carried something that made the hair on the back of several students' necks stand up. Because I was under the impression that you were discussing the superiority of Harmonist vocal cords over human ones. The professor's posture straightened, his natural arrogance rising to meet what he perceived as a direct challenge to his authority. Indeed we are, and I believe the evidence speaks quite clearly for itself. Then perhaps, Raven said, her voice dropping to a register that seemed to resonate in the student's bones, you'd be interested in a practical demonstration of what human vocal cords can actually accomplish when they're not trying to imitate something they were never designed for. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from academic discourse to something far more primal. Several students were beginning to look uncomfortable, their refined sensibilities detecting undercurrents that their conscious minds could not quite identify. Professor Vel'thune's skin had shifted to a confident gold, the color of someone who was absolutely certain he was about to deliver a devastating intellectual blow. By all means, he said, his voice carrying the full weight of his academic authority. Demonstrate the capabilities of your primitive Deathworld vocal apparatus. Raven smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. It was the smile of someone who had been systematically underestimated and was about to correct that misconception in the most direct way possible. You know, Professor, she said, her voice conversational but carrying an undertone that made the refined acoustic environment seem suddenly fragile. There's something important you should understand about Deathworld evolution. We don't develop capabilities for art or beauty or intellectual masturbation. We develop them for one thing only: survival. She took a deep breath, and the students instinctively prepared themselves for another cacophonous attempt at Harmonist vocal techniques. Instead, what emerged from her throat was something entirely different. It started as a low growl, barely audible, the kind of sound that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the primal fear centers of the brain. It was the sound of something large and deadly moving through tall grass, the whisper of apex predators in the dark. But it was also perfectly controlled, modulated with the precision of someone who understood exactly what she was doing. The growl rose in pitch and intensity, but not randomly. It followed patterns, frequencies that seemed to resonate with the very structure of the room itself. The Institute's carefully calibrated acoustic environment, designed to amplify and enhance refined vocal harmonics, suddenly became a weapon in the hands of someone who understood the physics of sound as a tool of warfare. Professor Vel'thune's confident expression began to falter as the sound penetrated his auditory organs and began to affect his nervous system. The Harmonists, for all their vocal sophistication, had evolved on a world of gentle breezes and singing crystals. Their refined hearing, capable of detecting the most subtle harmonic variations, was utterly unprepared for the assault of a voice that had been forged in the crucible of a world where silence meant death. The sound changed again, rising into something that was part howl, part roar, part battle cry. It was the voice of a species that had learned to make itself heard over the collapse of glaciers, the scream of atmospheric re-entry. the death cries of entire ecosystems. It was communication as weapon, as tool, as the ultimate expression of a will that refused to be silenced or ignored. Several students fled the room, their delicate nervous systems overwhelmed by frequencies their species had never encountered. Others sat frozen in their seats, their refined sensibilities paralyzed by the realization that they were witnessing something that transcended their understanding of what vocal communication could be. The room's acoustic systems, designed to enhance and beautify sound, instead amplified the primal terror that humans had once used to drive saber-toothed tigers from their caves and announce their presence to the cosmos itself. But Raven was not finished. The battle cry modulated into something that was almost speech, but speech as the galaxy had never heard it. It was communication stripped of all pretense, all civilization, all refinement. It was the voice of a species that had looked into the abyss of extinction and decided to scream defiance at the darkness. Professor Vel'thune staggered, his hands pressed to his auditory organs, his skin cycling rapidly through colors that indicated severe physiological distress. His carefully cultivated vocal cords, trained for decades to produce perfect harmonics, began to convulse under the assault of frequencies they had never been designed to process or counter. "Stop!" he gasped, but his voice was barely audible over the sound that seemed to fill every corner of the institute. "Please, in the name of all that is harmonious, stop!" But Raven had spent too many years being told that her voice was primitive, crude, inferior. She had endured months of condescending lectures about the superiority of refined communication. She had watched as her fellow students looked at her with the kind of pity typically reserved for the intellectually disabled. And now, finally, she had found her moment. The sound that emerged from her throat was no longer entirely human. It was the voice of every human who had ever stood against the darkness, every soldier who had faced impossible odds, every survivor who had refused to surrender to the indifferent cruelty of the universe. It was the collective scream of a species that had climbed from the mud and blood of a Deathworld to touch the stars themselves. Professor Vel'thune's vocal cords, traumatized by their desperate attempts to process and respond to the human battle cry, began to tear. His beautiful voice, the instrument that had made him famous throughout the galaxy, was being systematically destroyed by frequencies that his refined anatomy could not handle. The sound finally faded, leaving behind a silence that seemed to echo with the memory of barely contained violence. Raven stood in the center of the room, breathing hard but otherwise composed, while around her, the wreckage of academic arrogance slowly revealed itself. Professor Vel'thune was on his knees, his hands still pressed to his throat, his mouth moving in desperate attempts to produce sound. What emerged were harsh, mechanical croaks, utterly lacking the musical quality that had defined his identity for decades. "You see, Professor," Raven said, her voice once again perfectly normal, as if she had not just demonstrated the vocal equivalent of a nuclear weapon, "human vocal cords aren't primitive, they're specialized, optimized for a world where being heard could mean the difference between life and death, where communication had to cut through chaos and catastrophe and the screams of the dying." She looked around the room, at the terrified students, at the professor who was now making desperate gestures at his throat in a futile attempt to restore his damaged voice. "We didn't evolve to make pretty sounds," she continued, her voice carrying easily through the acoustic wreckage she had created. "We evolved to make effective ones, and sometimes, Professor, effectiveness is more important than elegance." Within hours, the finest medical minds in the galaxy confirmed what everyone already knew. Professor Vel'thune's vocal cords had been permanently damaged. The delicate structures that had once produced the most refined harmonics in known space had been traumatized beyond repair. He would need mechanical assistance to speak for the rest of his life. The irony was not lost on anyone with even a rudimentary understanding of poetic justice. The professor who had built his career on mocking primitive voices now spoke through a machine. The elegant critic of crude communication now relied on artificial harmonics to make himself understood. The man who had laughed at the Deathworld girl's voice had lost his own in the most humiliating way possible. Raven, meanwhile, found herself the subject of intense and somewhat terrified academic interest. the Institute's hastily established Department of Combat Communication offered her a full professorship. Students who had once pitied her rough voice now begged for lessons in what they euphemistically called aggressive vocal techniques. The final insult came when the Institute's curriculum was completely restructured to include mandatory courses in Deathworld communication theory, taught by the same human whose voice had once been dismissed as evolutionary failure. Professor Vel'thune, attending these lectures through mechanical necessity, was forced to listen to his former victim explain the sophisticated survival pressures that had shaped human vocal development. "You see," Raven would tell her students, her voice carrying easily through the reinforced acoustic chambers that had been installed after what the administration carefully referred to as the incident, "true communication isn't about making beautiful sounds. It's about making sure your message is received, understood, and, when necessary, feared." She would pause then, looking directly at the professor who sat in the front row, his mechanical voice synthesizer glowing softly at his throat like a badge of shame. After all, she would conclude with the kind of smile that suggested she was still capable of much worse, what good is the most beautiful voice in the galaxy if it can't survive contact with reality? Professor Vel'thune would attempt to respond, but his artificial voice box could produce only the flat, emotionless tones of a machine. The man who had once created symphonies of sound with his natural voice was now reduced to the kind of mechanical communication that even the most primitive species could achieve with basic technology. And in the back of the room, where she had once sat as an outsider, Raven would observe the reversal with the satisfaction of someone who had learned that the most effective response to sophisticated cruelty was often simple, brutal honesty. The Deathworld girl had found her voice, and the galaxy would never sound the same again. In the end, the Institute learned its most important lesson not from textbooks or lectures, but from the simple demonstration that some sounds, once heard, can never be forgotten. The universe had discovered that there was something far more dangerous than primitive communication, the assumption that refinement and strength were the same thing. Professor Vel'thune had learned this lesson more thoroughly than anyone else. Every time he spoke, every flat, mechanical word that emerged from his artificial voice box served as a reminder of the day he had underestimated a species that had learned to make itself heard over the screams of a dying world. The galaxy had finally learned to listen, and what it heard was the sound of humanity refusing to be silenced, diminished, or ignored ever again.